The swing to the far right is a growing trend in Europe and abroad. What distinguishes these parties, or are they all more or less the same? Do far-right parties differ much from country to country? What is driving the move by nations to move towards the far right? These and other considerations are explored in this thread, and hopefully a balanced view on the rise of the far right and nationalism across the globe. In the past decade and more, Europe has witnessed a significant swing to the far right in several countries, a trend that reflects broader political and societal shifts. This movement is characterized by the rise of populist, nationalist and anti-immigrant parties that reject traditional liberal values and prioritize a more exclusive, identity-based politics. The far right's resurgence is driven by a combination of economic, cultural and political factors, with different manifestations across various countries. While common themes run through far-right movements, such as opposition to immigration, anti-elite rhetoric, and skepticism towards the European Union, the specifics of each party's policies reflect their unique national contexts. Here's an overview of the swing to the far right in Europe and what distinguishes these parties. Key factors behind the rise of the far right. Immigration and national identity. One of the most consistent drivers of the far right surge across Europe is opposition to immigration, particularly from non-European countries, and more recently, since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, the alignment towards Russia and Vladimir Putin and his regime. Many far-right parties capitalize on fears about cultural dilution, loss of national identity, and the challenges of integrating large numbers of migrants. The 2015 refugee crisis, where over 1 million asylum seekers entered Europe, significantly boosted support for these parties, as many voters perceived mainstream parties as unable to handle the crisis effectively. The indicted war criminal Vladimir Putin has weaponized migration as part of his broader strategy to destabilize Europe and weaken Western unity. This tactic involves using the movement of migrants and refugees, particularly toward Europe, as a geopolitical tool to create political, social and economic pressure on countries that oppose Russian interests. Russia's strategy of hybrid warfare involves using a blend of conventional military power, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, energy dependency, and other tools to achieve its geopolitical goals. Weaponizing migration fits within this framework, as it aims to create domestic crises in target countries without direct military confrontation. The goal is often to exploit the vulnerabilities of open democratic societies and use humanitarian crises, such as migration, to fuel divisions and political polarization. Examples of migration weaponization include the Syrian civil war and the 2015 refugee crisis, Russia's indiscriminate bombing campaigns, especially in areas held by anti-Assad rebels, drove millions of Syrians to flee the country, many of whom sought refuge in Europe. Russia orchestrated the refugee crisis specifically to destabilize Europe. Its actions in Syria certainly contributed to the conditions that led to mass displacement. Additionally, Russia's diplomatic support for Assad has prolonged the war, which continues to generate migration flows. In 2021, Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, in concert with Putin, deliberately orchestrated a migrant crisis by encouraging refugees from the Middle East, Africa and Asia to travel to Belarus and then pushing them toward the borders of EU countries like Poland, Lithuania and Latvia. Thousands of migrants attempted to cross into the EU through these borders, creating a humanitarian crisis and straining relations between Belarus and its European neighbours. Lukashenko's actions were a retaliation for EU sanctions imposed after Belarus's 2020 elections, which were widely regarded as fraudulent. Russia supported or tacitly approved of this strategy, seeing it as a way to pressure the EU and create further divisions within the bloc. In addition to direct actions, Russia has been accused of using disinformation campaigns to inflame fears and anxieties about migration within Europe. Russian state media outlets like RT and Sputnik have frequently highlighted stories of crime and social unrest linked to migrants, particularly from Muslim majority countries, in an effort to stoke anti-immigrant sentiment. These narratives are often amplified by social media, which can lead to a rise in xenophobia and support for far-right political parties. By sowing discord over immigration, Russia seeks to exploit one of Europe's most divisive issues. Migration has been a key factor in the political fragmentation of the EU, with countries like Hungary and Poland adopting hardline anti-immigration stances, while others, like Germany and Sweden, have promoted more open policies. This internal division weakens the EU's ability to present a united front on other issues, including Russia's actions in Ukraine and its energy policies. Implications for European politics. The use of migration as a political weapon has had significant consequences for Europe: rise of populism and far-right parties. Migration has been a key driver of the rise of populist and far-right parties across Europe, many of which advocate for tougher immigration controls, nationalism and Euroscepticism. These parties often align with Russia's strategic interests by advocating for a weakening of the EU, closer ties with Russia, and opposition to Western sanctions on Russia. EU divisions migration has exacerbated divisions within the EU, with some countries refusing to accept refugees or migrants, while others, like Germany, have pushed for burden sharing. These internal rifts have weakened the EU's ability to present a cohesive policy on issues like immigration, border control, and foreign policy. Humanitarian crises. Weaponized migration also creates humanitarian crises, with migrants often used as pawns in geopolitical conflicts. The 2021 Belarus border crisis, for example, saw thousands of migrants stranded in harsh conditions, with EU countries reluctant to let them in, while Belarus used them as leverage. Russia's goals in weaponizing migration, Putin's broader goals in potentially weaponizing migration include weakening EU unity. By exploiting divisions over immigration, Russia aims to weaken the EU's ability to function as a coherent political and economic bloc. A divided EU is less likely to take strong, coordinated action against Russia on issues like sanctions or support for Ukraine, destabilizing European governments. Migration is a highly polarizing issue in many European countries. By fueling anti-immigrant sentiment, Russia can help destabilize governments that are seen as adversarial or too closely aligned with Western interests, diverting attention from Russia's actions. By creating crises related to migration, Russia can divert attention away from its own aggressive actions, such as its annexation of Crimea, interference in Ukraine, or domestic human rights abuses. Right? Let's return to the general explanation of the rise in support for far-right parties across Europe and the world. Economic anxiety. Economic insecurity driven by stagnating wages, unemployment and austerity measures after the 2008 financial crisis has led many voters to turn to far-right parties. These parties often tap into resentment against globalization and the European Union, accusing elites of prioritizing international interests over local concerns. Many far-right parties offer a populist economic platform, advocating for protectionist policies, welfare nationalism, meaning welfare benefits primarily for native citizens, and a rejection of neoliberal economic policies. Anti-establishment and populism. Far-right parties often position themselves as outsiders, railing against what they describe as corrupt, out-of-touch political elites. This anti-establishment rhetoric resonates with voters who feel disenfranchised by mainstream politics and dissatisfied with traditional parties. These movements tend to favour direct democracy, such as referenda, and call for a return to national sovereignty, often criticising institutions like the European Union for eroding national decision-making power. Cultural and social conservatism. In many cases, the far right is driven by conservative values, particularly around issues like gender roles, family structures, and religion. They promote traditionalism and are often opposed to progressive social changes such as LGBTQ+ rights or gender equality initiatives. In some cases, these parties are also Eurosceptic, opposing the influence of the EU's liberal values on national policies. Well, let us examine the far-right parties in Europe, a country-by-country look at the main players. All right, so France, National Rally or Rassemblement National, led by Marine Le Pen, the National Rally, formerly known as Front National, has been a major force in French politics. The party's core platform revolves around anti-immigration, opposition to the European Union, and economic protectionism. Le Pen advocates for French-first policies, including limiting immigration, restricting welfare to native-born citizens, and promoting traditional French values. Unlike some far-right movements, National Rally has attempted to soften its image in recent years, moderating its rhetoric on race and adopting a more mainstream populist appeal. Yet its core nationalist stance remains central. Now moving on to Germany, Alternative for Germany, or AfD. Initially, AfD emerged as a Eurosceptic party opposed to the euro, but quickly evolved into a far-right nationalist party following the 2015 refugee crisis. The AfD is staunchly anti-immigration, calling for stricter border controls, deportations, and opposition to the Islamization of Germany. It also promotes traditional family values and opposes many EU regulations. While the AfD has been criticised for ties to extremist and neo-Nazi groups, it has become a significant force in German politics, particularly in the former East Germany. Italy, Brothers of Italy, Fratelli d'Italia. Under Giorgia Meloni, the Brothers of Italy have become Italy's leading far-right party. The party is fiercely nationalistic, advocating for strict immigration controls, a rejection of multiculturalism, and a return to traditional Italian values. Meloni's platform includes Euroscepticism and a critique of global elites, but she balances this with a defense of Italian sovereignty within the EU framework. Social conservatism, protectionism, and support for a strong state are key components of the party's vision. Hungary Fidesz and Jobbik. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban's Fidesz party, though not typically classified as far-right, has adopted many far-right policies, particularly around immigration and national identity. Orban has pushed for illiberal democracy, emphasizing Hungary's Christian heritage, rejecting multiculturalism, and clamping down on media and civil society. Jobbik, a far-right party that used to have a more extreme platform, has moved toward the centre in recent years, but still supports nationalism and anti-immigration policies. Sweden Democrats. The Sweden Democrats, with their anti-immigration platform, have seen significant growth in recent years. The party has capitalised on concerns over immigration, integration and crime, particularly in the wake of Sweden's liberal asylum policies. While the Sweden Democrats have attempted to distance themselves from their neo-Nazi roots, they remain committed to a strong Swedish identity and cultural preservation. Poland Law and Justice Party, PIS. Poland's Law and Justice Party, though governing as a right-wing populist party, shares many far-right characteristics, especially around nationalism, social conservatism and Euroscepticism. The PIS government has enacted judicial reforms that critics argue undermine democratic norms, while also pushing anti-immigration and anti-LGBTQ+ policies. PS supports a Catholic-centric view of Polish national identity, opposing secular and progressive European norms. Let us also consider the far-right popularity further afield, in the global far-right movements and distinctions. United States, Trumpism and the alt-right. In the US, far-right politics is often associated with the rise of Donald Trump, whose 2016 presidential campaign focused on nationalism, anti-immigration rhetoric, and opposition to globalism. The far right in the US is also linked to movements such as the alt-right, which promotes white nationalism and anti-government sentiment. Unlike in Europe, where far-right parties have gained significant parliamentary representation, far-right politics in the US often operates within the Republican Party or on its fringes. The bedrock idea uniting right-wing communities who condone violence is that white Christian men in the United States are under cultural and demographic threat and require defending, and that it is the Republican Party and Donald Trump in particular who will safeguard their way of life. Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro. Brazil's far-right movement is embodied by former President Jair Bolsonaro. His platform includes nationalism, support for military rule, social conservatism, and opposition to leftist politics. Bolsonaro's presidency saw a rollback of environmental regulations, anti-LGBTQ+ rhetoric, and a strong defense of Brazil's military dictatorship past. Like many European far-right leaders, Bolsonaro rejected multilateralism and international cooperation, prioritizing national sovereignty. India Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP. While not traditionally considered far-right by European standards, the Hindu nationalist Bharatiya Janata Party, BJP, under Narendra Modi, embodies a form of right-wing nationalism centred around religion and identity. The BJP promotes Hindutva, an ideology that emphasises India's Hindu identity, often marginalising religious minorities like Muslims. This form of ethnic nationalism distinguishes it from European far-right parties, which focus more on racial and cultural identity. Common themes versus national differences. While far-right parties across Europe and the world share common themes, such as nationalism, anti-immigration, Euroscepticism, and opposition to progressive social policies, there are important national differences. For example, cultural identity. In Europe, the far right often invokes the protection of Christian heritage, while in India, it's Hindu nationalism. Economic policies. European far-right parties tend to support welfare policies for native citizens, while US far-right movements are often more economically libertarian, favouring limited government intervention. Attitudes toward democracy. In some countries like Hungary and Poland, far-right parties are criticised for undermining democratic institutions, while in others like France and Sweden, far-right parties operate within the democratic framework but push for significant changes in policy direction. Alternative for Germany and Brothers of Italy in the recent elections for the European Parliament seems like an inflection point in Western politics. It suggests that the European Union's most powerful states could soon be led by populist parties. French President Emmanuel Macron's call for elections to the National Assembly might lead to cohabitation should the RN win a majority and elect a far-right Prime Minister. Former US President Donald Trump and MAGA Republicans have a better than even chance of winning the US presidency by the end of the year. Are we defining the movements correctly? Foreign policy. Com raises some interesting questions, for example, on the use of the description of popularism. To understand the challenge posed by these far-right parties, they need to be properly named, not labelling them populist. In contemporary usage, populism is a term deployed by centrist commentators to claim a monopoly on political common sense for the moderate middle, an objective-sounding word for extremism and excess in the same way as centrism is a synonym for sensible moderation. But the currency populism has gained thanks to this rhetorical maneuver has been bought at the expense of coherence and precision. The term populism derives from a political movement in the southern and western states of the United States in the late 19th century. Agrarian cooperatives and trade unions in this region founded a political party in the early 1890s called the People's Party. The party demanded the government become more responsive to its rightful owners, the people. This sweeping rhetoric in favour of democratisation was central to the eponymous historical movement that birthed populism. It is an integral part of movements that can be properly described as populist, like Peronism in Latin America. But the way the term is now used in the West suggests instead that populism is a political style, not an ideological position, which can be used to describe the idiom of both right-wing and left-wing movements. Trump and Bernie Sanders, Jeremy Corbyn and Nigel Farage are routinely described as populists. The argument for this conflation is that both tendencies are defined by their hostility to the institutions, conventions, and expert elites that sustain liberal democracies. Populism, left and right, is said to be an expression of illiberal democracy, undomesticated by the rule of law. Benjamin Netanyahu, Vladimir Putin, Marine Le Pen, Giorgia Meloni, Mahendra Rajapaksa, Min Aung Hlaing, and Alice Weidel aren't populists. They are majoritarian nationalists. Every one of them has the same goal: to take the nominal majorities in their countries, defined by race or religion, and turn them into self-aware, supremacist majorities, determined to remake their nations in their own image, and to reduce religious and ethnic minorities to the ranks of second-class citizens or worse. The Western nation-states' failure to name or confront majoritarianism has helped the far-right mainstream itself. The once fringe but now respectable notion that the West's white Christian natives are being replaced by foreigners via legal and illegal immigration is the ideological foundation for the hegemony of the right. The popular appeal of majoritarian parties has pulled centrist parties like Sweden's Social Democratic Party and France's Renaissance to the right on immigration, to the point where their policy is nearly indistinguishable from the positions of far-right parties. Even Britain, Europe's most successfully multicultural country, has Labour, a social democratic party, criticising the Tories for not doing enough to reduce immigration. Tough talk about immigration is a form of dog whistling, whether it comes from a ruling majoritarian party like the Brothers of Italy or a centrist one like Britain's Conservative Party. Stephen Bush, writing in the Financial Times, notes that Meloni's government hasn't brought illegal immigration down. She's actually increased quotas for overseas workers. How could she do otherwise? Italy has one of the worst demographic deficits in the world. But to prove her hardline credentials, she has made it legal to detain an undocumented migrant for 18 months. Bush points out that an honest plan to restrict immigration would entail a public willingness to raise taxes to fund the services that immigrants provide, or a public commitment to curtail them. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Labour leader Keir Starmer haven't made that case, because they know that the voting public might not want immigrants, but it does want better care homes, a more efficient national health service, cheap deliveries, and low taxes. In the absence of candour or a willingness to make the case for immigration, muscular centrist rhetoric about limiting immigration piggybacks on majoritarian prejudice. The massive gains made by majoritarian parties in the recent European Parliament elections suggest that the centre's bid to steal the far right's lines isn't working. Conclusion: the swing to the far right across Europe reflects deeper social, economic, and political anxieties, often revolving around questions of national identity, sovereignty, and global integration. While these movements share a rejection of liberal progressive policies, the specific issues they focus on and their political strategies vary widely depending on their national context. As these parties gain power, their influence on both national and EU policies is likely to grow, creating new challenges for Europe's political and social cohesion. That's all for today, folks. Thank you for tuning in. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I also leave comments open for feedback, which I really appreciate. Did you know that I also provide daily updates and deep dive research videos on a range of interesting subjects, including economics, geopolitics, sanctions circumventions, fossil fuel updates, and much more? If you're able to support me with a coffee or subscription on Patreon, I do provide links in the description of the video. I really appreciate all the support I can get towards my research equipment and publication costs. Have a great day. I look forward to your next visit.